Two superpowers, 50 years, and enough nukes to kill everyone 10 times over. The Cold War stretched from secret labs to spy networks to smoky rooms where world-ending buttons sat way too close to human hands. This is the Cold War Iceberg. Tier 1. Berlin Wall. After World War II, the US and the Soviet Union went from allies to enemies pretty fast. Their new rivalry, built on ideology, paranoia, and too many nukes, became the Cold War, and nowhere showed that divide better than Berlin. Picture waking up one morning and realize you can't visit your grandma anymore. Not because she moved, but because someone built a massive wall through the middle of your city overnight. That's exactly what happened in Berlin on August 13, 1961. Germany got split into zones controlled by different countries. The Soviet Union took the east, while America, Britain, and France took the west. Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet territory, was also divided the same way. The issue was that people kept leaving East Germany. By 1961, around 3 million East Germans had escaped to the west through Berlin, which made communism look like a bad brand. Every defector was free propaganda for the West. That's like an entire city deciding they'd rather start over than stay under communist rule. Worse for the East German government, most of those leaving were young professionals. Doctors, engineers, teachers. The kind of people you really want to keep if you're trying to run a country. So one night, the East German government found a solution. They built a wall. At first, it was just barbed wire and guards, but soon it became a 12-foot-high concrete monster stretching 96 miles long. It had watchtowers, dogs, mines, and soldiers would shoot to kill orders. Families were split apart overnight. People who worked on one side but lived on the other couldn't return home. Some tried to escape by digging tunnels, hiding in car trunks, and even floating away in homemade hot air balloons. But it didn't always work out. At least 140 people died trying to cross. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years. When it finally came down in November 1989, people attacked it with hammers and pickaxes, crying and celebrating. It was the collapse of an era. The wall that once divided the world was now just rubble, and people took pieces of it home as souvenirs. Because after nearly 3 decades of separation, everyone deserved at least one small piece of freedom on their shelf. The checkpoints and tension in Berlin were intense. But the Cold War wasn't just in Europe. Later in Tier 5, you'll see how those same superpower rivalries led to secret programs in South America, like Operation Condor, where governments were quietly targeting their own people. Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days. That's how close the world came to ending in October 1962. All because two superpowers were locked into a staring contest, each holding enough nuclear firepower to wipe out civilization. It didn't happen out of nowhere. A year earlier, the US had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet border. The Soviets saw this as a direct threat. American weapons, just minutes from Moscow, didn't sit right with them. So when Fidel Castro took over Cuba and sided with the Soviets after the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, Moscow saw a perfect chance to even the score. If America could aim missiles from Turkey, the Soviets could aim theirs right back. From Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Castro agreed, partly for protection. After surviving one invasion and several CIA assassination attempts, he knew a Soviet nuclear umbrella was the best insurance plan. When U-2 spy planes brought back images of missiles in Cuba, Washington panicked. And you can't really blame them. Those things could strike D.C., New York, and the East Coast in under 10 minutes. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice. If he did nothing, he looked weak. If he ordered an airstrike, it could trigger nuclear war. And if he invaded Cuba, it might start one instantly. Every option had global catastrophe written all over it. Kennedy went for a middle ground, a naval blockade. U.S. warships surrounded Cuba, cutting off Soviet shipments. The Soviets called it an act of war. American bombers armed up with nuclear weapons, while Soviet subs circled nearby carrying nuclear torpedoes. Both sides had their fingers on the trigger. Behind closed doors, generals pushed for invasion, but Kennedy hesitated because he knew one mistake could end everything. In one chilling moment, a Soviet submarine under U.S. warning fire nearly launched a nuclear torpedo, stopped only because one officer refused to approve it. Then came the letters. Kennedy and Khrushchev began exchanging personal messages, searching for a way out. On day 13, a deal emerged. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and in return, the US would secretly dismantle its missiles in Turkey. Just like that, the world stepped back from the edge. Everyone involved aged about 10 years, and both sides learned that nuclear diplomacy by guesswork was a bad idea. So they set up the red phone hotline between Washington and Moscow, a direct teletype line for talking instead of panicking. The space race. In the Cold War, space became the new battlefield. The idea was that whoever conquered the heavens could claim their system ruled Earth. For the US and the Soviet Union, every rocket launch could become a political sermon. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. Democracy versus dictatorship. It all kicked off on October 4, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched a tiny metal sphere named Sputnik. It was about the size of a beach ball and did exactly two things: orbit the planet and beep. That's it. But that little beep beep sent America into a full-blown existential crisis. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, maybe next they could launch a nuclear bomb straight from orbit. The space race became the Cold War's most glamorous competition. Both sides poured billions into rockets, satellites, and moon dreams. Not out of curiosity, but out of paranoia and pride. This was about showing whose scientists were smarter and whose ideology was stronger. The Soviets scored first, again and again. They launched the first satellite, sent the first animal into space. Poor Laika never made it back. And put the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit in 1961. He became a global celebrity overnight. Even the first spacewalk was theirs. Meanwhile, America was still playing catch-up. Then, John F. Kennedy's Moonshot Challenge. Put a man on the moon before the decade ended. At the time, the US could barely launch a reliable rocket. But sure, why not aim for the moon? NASA scrambled to make it happen, racing through the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs like an over-caffeinated engineering marathon. The road to glory was anything but smooth. Rockets blew up, missions failed, and people died. Like the Apollo 1 crew that got trapped in a cabin fire during a pre-flight test. The Soviets had their own disasters too, losing cosmonauts to botched launches and re-entry failures they kept hidden for years. The human cost got buried under all the propaganda, but it was always there. Then, on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. Over 600 million people watched as the American flag was planted on lunar soil. The US had officially won the space race. The Soviets tried to keep pace, but their moon program quietly fizzled out. Beyond the bragging rights, the space race mattered because it transformed technology, politics, and even identity. Vietnam War. Vietnam was supposed to be simple. Stop communism from spreading in Southeast Asia. Instead, it became America's longest and most controversial Cold War headache. After World War II, Vietnam wanted independence from France. France said no. Vietnam fought back. France lost, leaving a power vacuum the US rushed to fill. In 1954, the Geneva Accords cleaned up the mess, temporarily dividing Vietnam into North, communist, and South, non-communist. The plan was to hold nationwide elections to reunify the country. But both sides got cold feet. Democracy sounded great in theory, just not when the other guy might win. North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, pushed to unite the country under communism. South Vietnam, backed by the United States, wanted to stay independent. And America, terrified of the domino theory, believed that if Vietnam fell, the rest of Asia would topple next. So the US stepped in, first with advisors and money, then with boots on the ground. Things really escalated in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. US ships reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats twice. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically handing President Johnson the green light to go all in on Vietnam. Later, evidence showed the second attack probably never happened. Too late. War was already in motion. The Viet Cong didn't fight like a regular army. They struck fast, vanished into the jungle, and used traps, tunnels, and ambushes that made the US military feel like it was fighting ghosts. American soldiers couldn't tell who was a farmer and who was waiting to blow them up, which made winning hearts and minds difficult when everything kept exploding. Meanwhile, the war played out on television, turning dinner time into a horror show. Public opinion tanked, students protested, draft cards burned, and make love, not war became the national mood. After years of fighting and over 58,000 American deaths, the US withdrew in 1973. 2 years later, North Vietnam captured Saigon, uniting the country under communist rule. Vietnam shattered America's image of invincibility. It proved that even superpowers can't win every fight, especially when they're not sure what they're fighting for. Tier 2. Marshall Plan. When World War II ended in 1945, Europe looked like someone had rage-quit civilization. Cities were flattened, farms were dust, and factories were just fancy piles of metal. Millions were left homeless and hungry, which, as history repeatedly shows, is the perfect recipe for bad political decisions. Enter the Marshall Plan. Officially, the European Recovery Program, but unofficially, America's Make Europe Not Communist Again campaign. Starting in 1948, the U.S. handed out over $13 billion in aid, which would be more than $100 billion today. They rebuilt roads, factories, and farms, basically turning Europe's post-apocalyptic wasteland vibe into something closer to functional society. Of course, this wasn't pure charity. The US was being strategically nice. The idea was simple. If European countries had stable jobs and working light bulbs, they'd be less tempted to vote for communism. Plus, a rich Europe meant more customers for American products. It was humanitarian aid with a side of capitalism. The results were impressive. Western Europe bounced back faster than anyone expected. West Germany became an industrial powerhouse. France and Britain got back on their feet, and Italy's economy finally stopped wobbling. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union told its Eastern Bloc allies to skip the Marshall money, which mostly meant slower growth and a lot of political gray for decades. In the long game of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan was one of America's smartest plays. Instead of dropping bombs, they dropped money. And while weapons win battles, it turns out that refrigerators, cars, and full dinner plates win loyalty. Bay of Pigs invasion. Sometimes the CIA has brilliant plans, but this was not one of those times. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over Cuba and started cozying up to the Soviet Union. The US wanted him gone. So in 1961, the CIA trained about 1,400 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The plan was to land on the beach, trigger an uprising, and overthrow Castro. Easy, right? Wrong. Everything went wrong. First, the secret invasion wasn't secret at all. Castro knew it was coming. Second, the CIA expected Cuban citizens to join the invasion once it started. They didn't. Most Cubans either supported Castro or were too scared to fight. Third, President Kennedy pulled back the air support at the last minute, worried about making the US look too aggressive. So these 1,400 Cuban exiles landed on the beach and immediately got hammered. Castro's forces surrounded them within days. Some invaders died. The rest got captured. It was a total disaster, and it made America look both aggressive and incompetent at the same time. The failed invasion pushed Castro even closer to the Soviet Union, which directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. Kennedy took responsibility for the mess, but he was probably furious at the CIA for selling him such a terrible plan. The Bay of Pigs taught America a hard lesson. Just because you want to overthrow a foreign government doesn't mean you can. And when your secret operation becomes public, you lose both ways. You don't achieve your goal, and you look bad trying. Tsar Bomba. On October 30, 1961, the Soviet Union tested the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated. They named it Tsar Bomba, which literally means Emperor of Bombs. And honestly, that's about right. Tsar Bomba had an explosive yield of 50 megatons. That's 50 million tons of TNT, making it more than 3,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. When they tested it over an Arctic island, the fireball was 5 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose over 40 miles high. So tall it went to space. The flash of light could be seen 600 miles away. The shockwave from the explosion circled the Earth 3 times. Buildings hundreds of miles from the test site lost windows. Seismometers around the world picked up the blast. And one witness described it as if the whole world was on fire. Here's the crazy part. The Soviets actually designed Tsar Bomba to be 100 megatons, but they scaled it down. Even the people who built it started to question what they'd unleashed, realizing this was less a weapon and more a warning to humanity. So why build such a monster? The answer is pretty simple. The Soviet Union wanted to send a message. They wanted America to know they could make bombs so big that defense wouldn't matter. It was the ultimate flex in the arms race. Luckily, Tsar Bomba was never used in war. The thing was too heavy, too clumsy, and honestly too apocalyptic to be useful. As a symbol, though, it worked. After that blast, the world stopped pretending this was about winning and started thinking about how to survive. Chernobyl Disaster. The Cold War was basically a decades-long flex-off between the US and the Soviet Union. Both sides were obsessed with proving who had better tech, bigger rockets, and safer nukes. And then, in 1986, the Soviets accidentally gave the world the worst product demo in history. On April 26, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine decided to go off script. It wasn't a nuclear bomb-level blast, but the steam explosion was strong enough to blow the 1,000-ton lid right off the reactor. That alone was bad enough, but then the exposed core started spewing radioactive material into the air. It all began during a safety test, which is ironic because it made everything significantly less safe. Operators had turned off crucial safety systems and pushed the reactor into an unstable state. When they tried to shut it down, the power spiked uncontrollably. 2 workers died instantly, and many more succumbed to radiation poisoning in the following weeks. The real horror was what came next. For 10 straight days, radioactive smoke drifted into the atmosphere, hitching a ride on the wind across Europe. The Soviets, of course, tried to keep it quiet, because admitting mistakes wasn't really their thing. The world only found out when Sweden's radiation detectors went off, forcing Moscow to make a confession, if you can even call it that. They went, "Oh yeah, small issue, nothing major." The nearby city of Pripyat, home to about 50,000 people, was evacuated 36 hours after the explosion. Residents were told it was temporary and to pack light. Spoiler, they never came back. The town is still there, frozen in time, silent, and filled with reminders of what life looked like in 1986. Firefighters and liquidators were sent in to contain the disaster, dropping sand, lead, and concrete over the burning reactor from helicopters. It was a heroic effort, and also a death sentence for many of them, as radiation doses soared off the charts. Eventually, a massive concrete sarcophagus was built over the reactor. The long-term effects are still debated, but thousands developed cancer, and the surrounding area, now called the exclusion zone, is still too radioactive for permanent residents. Ironically, nature doesn't seem to mind. Wolves, deer, and other wildlife now roam freely there, living their best post-human lives. Tier 3. Operation Paperclip. When World War II ended, the US and Soviet Union both had the same idea. Grab as many Nazi scientists as possible before the other side gets them. Operation Paperclip was America's secret program that brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States after the war. Many of them had worked directly for the Nazi regime, designing rockets, chemical weapons, and other military technology. The most famous was Wernher von Braun. Von Braun and his team knew more about rocket science than anyone else in the world, and America wanted that knowledge. So they wiped his Nazi background clean, gave him a new identity, and put him to work for NASA. Von Braun eventually designed the Saturn V rocket that took Americans to the moon. Without him, the US probably doesn't win the space race. But here's the uncomfortable truth. His V-2 rockets were built by concentration camp prisoners working as slaves. Thousands of them died in the tunnels where the rockets were assembled. The US government knew about these scientists' pasts. They just didn't care. The Cold War was heating up, and they needed advanced weapons and technology immediately. If they didn't recruit these scientists, the Soviets would. So they made a deal with people who'd worked for one of history's most evil regimes. Operation Paperclip stayed mostly secret until the 1970s, when reporters started digging into who exactly the United States had brought over and what they'd done during the war. The program showed how quickly America's morals got flexible when national security was at stake. Fighting communism became so important that working with former Nazis seemed like an acceptable trade-off. MK Ultra. What if you could control someone's mind, erase memories, plant new ones, maybe even make them kill without realizing it? That's what the CIA wanted to figure out with Project MK Ultra. Starting in 1953, the CIA ran secret experiments testing drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture to see if they could control human behavior. They were terrified that the Soviets and Chinese had cracked mind control, especially after American prisoner of war from the Korean War came home acting strange. The experiments were deeply unsettling. CIA doctors gave LSD to unsuspecting people, including their own colleagues and ordinary citizens. One CIA employee, Frank Olson, you'll hear more about him in Tier 5, was secretly dosed with LSD and later died under suspicious circumstances. And it didn't stop there. The CIA also experimented on prisoners, psychiatric patients, and drug addicts, people who had no real way to say no. They even worked with universities, where students signed up thinking they were joining harmless psychology studies, only to end up as test subjects in secret mind control research. One experiment involved putting people in dark, soundproof rooms for days or weeks. Another used extreme doses of LSD combined with sensory deprivation. They also tried hypnosis, electric shocks, pretty much anything they could think of. The goal was to break down someone's personality and rebuild it however they wanted. The worst part? Most of it didn't even work. Mind control turned out to be way harder than the CIA hoped, but they kept trying for 20 years, destroying lives in the process. In 1973, as MKUltra was on the verge of exposure, CIA Director Richard Helms made sure almost all the project's files were destroyed. The only reason we even know it existed is because a few boxes of financial documents accidentally survived. MKUltra represents the dark side of Cold War paranoia. The CIA became so obsessed with beating the Soviets that they threw away ethics and experimented on people without consent. It's one of those conspiracies people used to laugh about until the declassified files proved every word. Lost cosmonauts. Here's a creepy conspiracy theory that might actually have some truth to it. What if the Soviet Union sent cosmonauts into space before Yuri Gagarin? But those missions failed, so they erased those people from history. The lost cosmonauts theory claimed that several Soviet space missions went wrong in the late 1950s and early 1960s, killing the cosmonauts on board. Instead of admitting failure, the Soviet government just pretended those missions never happened. Two Italian brothers, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia, claimed they picked up secret Soviet radio transmissions from space. In one 1961 recording, they said they heard a female cosmonaut struggling to breathe as her spacecraft burned up during re-entry. In another, a cosmonaut's heartbeat could be heard slowing down as his capsule drifted into deep space. The tapes are genuinely creepy, though whether they're real or not is still up for debate. There's some circumstantial evidence, though. Photos of the Soviet space program got edited. Cosmonauts who showed up in early group shots quietly disappeared from later ones. Some trainees were erased from official records without explanation, and several deaths were written off as accidents that seemed anything but ordinary. People have long speculated that the Soviet Union tried to cover up its space failures. According to these claims, if a mission went wrong, officials would announce it was unmanned, and if a cosmonaut died, they'd say it was a car or plane crash rather than admit it happened during a space mission. Yuri Gagarin's 1961 mission is still officially recognized as the first human spaceflight, but there's no solid evidence that anyone was secretly launched and erased from history. Still, the fact that it's even plausible says a lot about how secretive the Soviet space program really was. They cared more about propaganda victories than cosmonaut safety, and so it's possible that they would have hidden failures if they thought they could get away with it. Broken arrow accidents. Broken arrow was the US military code for a nuclear accident, lost bombs, accidental drops, or near explosions. And during the Cold War, things went wrong way more often than you'd think. The US military officially acknowledges 32 broken arrow incidents between 1950 and 1980, though the real number is probably higher. These include nuclear bombs dropped accidentally, planes crashing with nukes on board, and weapons lost at sea. In 1958, a B-47 bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb right into someone's backyard in South Carolina. The conventional explosives detonated, blowing a crater 30 feet deep. But luckily, the nuclear core didn't go off. Imagine looking out your window and seeing a mushroom cloud in your neighbor's yard. In 1961, a B-52 bomber broke apart over North Carolina, dropping 2 nuclear bombs. One bomb's parachute opened, and it landed gently in a field. The other crashed into a swamp where they recovered it. They found that 5 of 6 safety switches had failed. One switch prevented a nuclear explosion. Just one. In 1966, a B-52 collided with a tanker plane over Spain, dropping 4 nuclear bombs. 2 landed intact, 1 fell into the ocean and took months to find, and 1 smashed into the ground, spreading radioactive plutonium across the countryside. The US had to scoop up tons of contaminated soil and ship it back to America. And those are just the US incidents we know about. The Soviet Union had its own accidents, though they were more secretive. Several Soviet submarines sank with nuclear weapons aboard. One Soviet nuclear missile exploded on its launch pad, killing dozens of people. The scary thing about broken arrow incidents is that they show how close we came to accidental nuclear disasters. These weapons were supposed to be perfectly safe, But they got dropped, crashed, burned, and lost. And every time, we got lucky that the nuclear core didn't detonate. Eventually, that luck might run out. Tier 4. The Moscow Signal. During the height of the Cold War, paranoia not only stayed in the shadows, it buzzed through the walls. From 1953 to the late 1970s, the Soviet Union quietly beamed microwave radiation at the US Embassy in Moscow. The CIA detected the strange signal early on, but chose secrecy over safety. Only a handful of top officials knew the embassy was being microwaved by the Soviets. No one could agree on the reason. Some suspected the microwaves powered hidden Soviet bugs planted inside the walls, while others believed it was psychological warfare, a slow-burn experiment to test whether radiation could weaken or control human minds. For 2 decades, American diplomats worked, ate, and raised families under that invisible beam. When the news finally leaked in the 1970s, panic erupted. Some embassy staff had developed cancers and strange illnesses, and now they had questions. Was it stress, coincidence, or something far more deliberate? The US government handled the situation with the same secrecy it despised in the Soviets. Instead of full disclosure, they quietly monitored their own people, running health studies without consent. The diplomats weren't just targets of Moscow. They'd become unknowing test subjects for Washington, too. By the late 70s, the signal vanished, as if the Soviets simply turned off the switch. Maybe they realized they'd been caught. Maybe the experiment ended. To this day, no one knows what the true purpose was or whether it worked. The Moscow signal remains one of the Cold War's strangest and most unsettling mysteries. It showed that in the race for global dominance, even invisible radio waves could be turned into weapons. Project Iceworm. At the height of the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear staring contest, America tried something straight out of a spy movie. Beneath the frozen wastelands of Greenland, they began carving out a secret military base, one designed to strike the Soviet Union from under the ice itself. This was Project Iceworm, a classified plan to hide up to 600 nuclear missiles under Greenland's ice sheet, each one aimed squarely at Moscow. From 1959 to 1963, the US Army built Camp Century, a bizarre underground complex with 21 tunnels stretching nearly 2 miles. It had everything: living quarters, a hospital, a theater, even a chapel, all powered by a nuclear reactor buried in the snow. Publicly, the base was sold as an Arctic research station. In reality, it was meant to become a hidden missile city. The idea was to build thousands of miles of tunnels and move missiles around on underground railways so the Soviets could never target them. It was basically a nuclear version of Catch Me If You Can. But nature didn't play along. Ice moves, slowly, steadily, and with enough force to reshape entire landscapes. The tunnels began collapsing, the structure warped, and the dream of a secret missile labyrinth literally started melting. Project Iceworm was quietly scrapped in 1963, and Camp Century shut down a few years later. The US removed the reactor, but left behind chemical waste, radioactive coolant, and diesel fuel, assuming it would stay frozen forever. Now, as Greenland's ice melts, that waste is creeping back toward the surface, threatening a new environmental crisis. Denmark, which actually owns Greenland, wasn't even told about the plan until the 1990s. And let's just say they weren't thrilled. Project Iceworm was one of the Cold War's weirdest plans. The US was so scared of Soviet missiles that it actually tried to build a hidden nuclear base under the ice. Operation Popeye. What if you could control the weather and use it as a weapon? During the Vietnam War, the US military tried exactly that. In the Cold War's shadow, science and strategy often blurred into madness. And that explains why the US military actually tried to turn the sky itself into a weapon and called it Operation Popeye. From 1967 to 1972, during the Vietnam War, American planes flew thousands of secret missions over North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, releasing silver iodide particles into the clouds to make it rain harder and longer. The goal was simple but insane: flood the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the crucial supply route for North Vietnamese forces, until it turned into a swamp of mud. Their motto was "Make mud, not war." In total, over 2,600 flights were carried out to make the clouds do the Pentagon's work. Did it work? Only partially. The rain probably increased, but it didn't stop the North Vietnamese. They adapted quickly, rerouting supplies, rebuilding bridges, and waiting out the man-made storms. When journalists exposed the operation in 1971, the public reaction was explosive. The idea that the US had literally tried to control the weather for war shocked even Cold War hardliners. It showed just how desperate the superpowers had become to outsmart each other. The global backlash was so strong it led to the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, banning weather manipulation in warfare. 1979 Nuclear False Alarm. On November 9, 1979, NORAD's computers suddenly showed that the Soviet Union had launched a massive nuclear strike against the United States. Missile silos went on alert and bomber crews rushed to their planes. The president would have had to decide within minutes whether to launch American missiles in retaliation or risk losing them to incoming Soviet warheads. Except it was all a mistake. Someone had accidentally loaded a training exercise tape into NORAD's computer system, and the system treated it as a real attack. Within minutes, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski got a call saying 2,200 Soviet missiles were on the way. He had between 3 and 7 minutes to advise President Carter on whether to launch a counterstrike. Brzezinski was literally getting ready to wake the president and tell him to start World War III when a second call came through. It was a false alarm. The computers had made a mistake. But it gets worse. This wasn't a one-time thing. Similar false alarms happened several times in 1979 and 1980. In June 1980, the same kind of computer error made it look like the Soviets were launching attacks. Each time, alert crews scrambled, and each time they realized it was a mistake with only minutes to spare. Think about how close we came. If one person had panicked, if the checks had failed, or if someone had said, "We can't risk waiting. Launch now." Nuclear war could have started over a computer glitch. The 1979 incidents led to better systems and more safeguards, but they revealed something terrifying. The fate of the world depends on computers and split-second human decisions. And those computers made mistakes more often than anyone wanted to admit. Tier 5. Acoustic Kitty. In the 1960s, the CIA had a brilliant idea to turn a cat into a spy device. And no, this isn't a joke. They called it Acoustic Kitty, and they spent about $20 million on it. The plan was to surgically implant a microphone in a cat's ear canal, hide a radio transmitter in its skull, and thread a wire antenna through its tail. They trained the cat to walk near Soviet agents and eavesdrop on their conversations. Because who would ever suspect a house cat of espionage? The surgery took years to perfect. Vets carefully implanted all the equipment while trying to keep the cat alive and functional. They had to make sure the cat could still hear, move normally, and not act like it had electronic equipment crammed inside its body. Training was another nightmare. Cats don't take orders like dogs. They wander wherever they want, get distracted by literally everything, and definitely don't understand the concept of saving the world from nuclear doom. The CIA tried to train the cats to walk towards specific targets and stay long enough to record them. Finally, after 5 years and millions of dollars, they were ready for the first field test. They drove the cat to a park near the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., pointed it toward 2 men sitting on a bench, and released it. The cat immediately walked into the street and got hit by a taxi. The mission lasted less than a minute. All that surgery, training, and money went down the drain because the cat did what cats do: ignore everything humans want and go wherever looks interesting. The CIA officially shut down Acoustic Kitty in 1967. The classified documents claimed they learned valuable lessons about using animals in espionage, which is a very polite way of saying this was a complete disaster and we wasted everyone's time. Acoustic Kitty proved Cold War intelligence agencies would try anything, even ideas that should have stayed in a cartoon. Operation Condor. While Americans worried about communist uprisings, South American dictators took a more brutal approach. They created Operation Condor, a secret alliance to hunt down, kidnap, torture, and kill anyone they considered a leftist threat. Starting in the 1970s, military dictatorships in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil cooperated to eliminate political opponents. If a Chilean activist fled to Argentina, Chilean agents could work with Argentine police to capture them. If someone escaped to Paraguay, they'd be hunted there too. There was nowhere safe to run. The operation resulted in at least 60,000 deaths, though the real number is probably much higher. Victims included students, union leaders, journalists, professors, and anyone who criticized the government. Many of them were kidnapped by security forces, tortured for information, and ultimately killed and buried in unmarked graves. The United States knew about Operation Condor, and according to declassified documents, supported it. The CIA provided intelligence training to these governments, and America sent military aid and equipment. The logic was simple. These dictatorships were anti-communist, so they must be the good guys, regardless of how many civilians they murdered. One of the most shocking attacks happened in Washington, D.C. In 1976, agents from Chile's secret police planted a car bomb that killed Orlando Letelier, a Chilean diplomat who deposed the dictatorship, along with his American assistant. They literally carried out an assassination on American soil, and the US government was slow to respond because Chile was an ally. Operation Condor stayed mostly secret until the 1990s, when South American countries transitioned back to democracy and started investigating what their governments had done. Mass graves were discovered, torture centers were revealed, and survivors finally got a chance to tell their stories. The operation represents one of the Cold War's darkest chapters. In the name of fighting communism, the US supported governments that tortured and murdered their own citizens. It's a reminder that the enemy of my enemy isn't always a friend. Sometimes they're just a different kind of monster. Frank Olson. In November 1953, a man fell from a New York hotel window. Officially, it was a suicide. Unofficially, it was one of the CIA's darkest secrets. Frank Olson was a biochemist who worked for the US Army's Special Operations Division, developing biological weapons. He was also unknowingly part of the CIA's MK-Ultra program. On November 19, 1953, Olson attended a work retreat in Maryland. During dinner, his boss spiked everyone's drinks with LSD without telling them. This was standard Mark Ultra practice, dosing unsuspecting people to see how they'd react without their consent. Olson had a terrible reaction. He became paranoid and depressed and started questioning the biological weapons work he'd been doing. Some reports say he wanted to quit and possibly even reveal what the army was working on, which made his bosses nervous. They sent Olson to New York to see a CIA psychiatrist. On the night of November 28, he crashed through his hotel room window on the 13th floor and died on the sidewalk below. For 22 years, his family believed he'd taken his own life. Then, in 1975, the Church Committee's investigation into CIA abuses reveals that Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD as part of MK-Ultra. President Ford publicly apologized, and the family got a settlement. But that wasn't the end of it. The Olson family kept digging. Eric Olson, his son, spent decades investigating his father's death and found major inconsistencies in the official story. The hotel room showed signs of a struggle, and witnesses said there were multiple people inside. A second autopsy in 1994 revealed injuries consistent with being hit on the head before going out the window. Eric Olson believes his father was murdered, either because he knew too much about illegal bioweapons work or because the CIA feared he'd expose MK-Ultra. The case was reopened in the 1990s, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone. We'll probably never know exactly what happened that night, but Frank Olson's death showed how easily people could be sacrificed during the Cold War. Whether he jumped, was pushed, or thrown, he died because of a program that treated American citizens like disposable test subjects. Stanislav Petrov. On September 26, 1983, Stanislav Petrov sat in a Soviet bunker monitoring satellite systems that watched for American nuclear launches. It was just after midnight when the alarms went off. The system showed that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles toward the Soviet Union. Petrov had minutes to decide, report the attack to his superiors, who would then launch Soviet missiles in retaliation, or trust his gut that something was wrong. This was during one of the most volatile periods of the Cold War. A few weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down a Korean passenger jet that accidentally flew into their airspace, killing everyone aboard. Relations between the superpowers were at a low point, and as a result, an American nuclear strike seemed possible. Military protocol was clear. If satellites detected a launch, report it immediately. But Petrov hesitated. Something felt off. Why would America start a nuclear war with only 5 missiles? If they were really attacking, they'd launch everything at once. He decided to report it as a system malfunction, not an attack. He was right. Ground-based radars, which took longer but were more reliable, showed nothing, not a single missile. It turned out to be a false alarm caused by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which the satellite system mistook for missile launches. If Petrov had followed protocol, his report would have gone up the chain of command, and Soviet leaders, already paranoid and suspicious of America, might have launched a retaliatory strike. The world could have ended because of a computer error and sunlight. Petrov wasn't rewarded for saving the world. Actually, he got in trouble. His superiors were embarrassed that their satellite system had failed. Petrov was reprimanded for not properly recording the incident, and he ended up retiring early after suffering a nervous breakdown. For years, almost nobody knew about Petrov's decision. The incident stayed classified until the 1990s, when Soviet files were released. Suddenly, people realized this random lieutenant colonel had single-handedly prevented nuclear war. Petrov died in 2017. Before his death, he was recognized as a hero by peace organizations around the world. But he always downplayed what he did, saying he was just doing his job. One man's judgment call, made in minutes, against every rule, saved billions of lives, and almost no one knew until decades later. Which begs the question, how many other close calls were there that we still don't know about? Tier 6. Operation Sea Spray. In September 1950, U.S. Navy secretly tested how vulnerable American cities were to germ warfare by spraying bacteria over San Francisco. For 6 days, a Navy ship sailed along the coast, releasing clouds of bacteria called Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi. The bacteria were supposed to be harmless, just tracers to see how far they'd spread. The wind carried the bacteria throughout the city. They drifted through streets, into buildings, and into homes. Nearly everyone in San Francisco inhaled them. The Navy collected samples to track the spread and measure how well their simulated attack worked. Then, people started getting sick. 11 people developed serious urinary tract infections caused by Serratia marcescens. One man, Edward Nevin, died. His was the first recorded death from Serratia marcescens in the Bay Area. Before the Navy's experiment, the bacteria was virtually unknown in the region. The Navy insisted their test bacteria couldn't have caused the infections. They claimed Serratia marcescens was harmless and that the outbreak was just a coincidence. They classified the experiment, and most people never knew what happened. The truth came out in the 1970s during congressional hearings on government testing. Edward Nevin's family sued, but the court ruled that the government wasn't liable since the experiment was considered a military operation. Operation Sea Spray was just one of hundreds of biological warfare tests the U.S. military conducted on American cities between 1949 and 1969. They sprayed bacteria in subways, released it from light bulbs to see how it spread through buildings, and conducted experiments in airports, bus terminals, and highways. The military claimed they needed to study how biological weapons spread so they could defend against a Soviet attack, but they never asked anyone's permission. Entire cities were exposed without knowing it, turning millions of Americans into unwitting test subjects. Even if most of the bacteria was harmless, most isn't all. Stalin analyzed Mao's poop. This one sounds like a joke, but it's real. Soviet intelligence service collected and analyzed the feces of foreign leaders to learn about their health, personality, and psychological state. The idea came from studying how diet and digestion affected mood and behavior. Soviet scientists believed they could determine someone's temperament by examining their bathroom business. High-stress hormones, they're anxious and might make rash decisions. Signs of certain medications, they're dealing with health problems that could affect negotiations. Stalin, ever the micromanager, wanted every possible advantage in diplomacy, including what came out of the toilet. He wanted to know everything about the foreign leaders he dealt with. Their fears, their weaknesses, their health problems, you name it. So Soviet intelligence started what they called material operations. When foreign leaders visited Moscow, the secret police would secretly collect samples from their toilets. Special teams would analyze the samples for traces of hormones, medications, diseases, anything that might provide useful information. One of their main targets was Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China. Even though the Soviet Union and China were technically allies, Stalin didn't trust Mao. He wanted leverage. So during Mao's visits to Moscow in the 1940s and 1950s, Soviet agents collected samples and sent them to laboratories for analysis. Did it work? Sort of. They could determine some basic health information and maybe get hints about stress levels, but predicting someone's behavior from their poop turned out to be mostly pseudoscience. Still, Stalin believed in it, so the program continued. The Soviet Union wasn't alone in these weird intelligence operations. Western intelligence agencies did similar things, though probably not as extensively. The Cold War turned everything into potential intelligence. Phone calls, trash, personal habits, and yes, poop. This story is funny on the surface, but it represents how paranoid leaders became during the Cold War. Trust between nations was so low that analyzing someone's waste for hidden clues seemed like a reasonable intelligence strategy. Operation Mockingbird. What if the CIA secretly controlled the news? That was the goal of Operation Mockingbird. Starting in the 1950s, the CIA recruited journalists, editors, and media executives to spread propaganda and suppress stories that could damage American interests. They paid reporters to write articles supporting U.S. foreign policy. They planted fake stories to discredit enemies, and they convinced newspapers to kill investigations into CIA activities. The operation was massive. Declassified documents suggest hundreds of journalists were involved. Some knowingly, others unknowingly, working with the CIA through major outlets like the New York Times, CBS, and Time magazine. The agency wrote articles and handed them to cooperative journalists to publish under their own names. They also fed fake intelligence to reporters, who ran stories citing anonymous sources that were actually CIA officers. And if a newspaper tried to expose something embarrassing, the CIA would quietly pressure editors to bury it. Operation Mockingbird became the perfect Cold War weapon. It let the CIA shape public opinion, sell foreign interventions to the public, and cover up its own illegal activities, all while pretending the press was free and independent. The operation began to unravel in the 1970s during congressional investigations. Journalists who had cooperated with the CIA were exposed, and news organizations that worked with the agency faced major scandals. The Church Committee hearings revealed just how deep the media manipulation went. In 1976, CIA Director George H.W. Bush officially ended the program and promised the CIA wouldn't use journalists as agents anymore. But critics argue that similar tactics continue in different forms. If you can't trust that news is real and not propaganda, how can citizens make informed decisions? Operation Gladio. After World War II ended, Western European governments had a scary thought. What if the Soviet Union invaded? What if communists took over from within? They needed a backup plan. Secret armies that could resist occupation and fight back. Operation Gladio was that backup plan, and it went way beyond what anyone expected. With CIA and NATO support, several European countries established secret stay-behind networks. Hidden cells of trained operatives with hidden weapon caches ready to activate if the Soviets invaded. Italy, Belgium, France, Germany, and others all had these networks. In theory, it made sense. If your country got occupied, these secret soldiers could organize resistance, sabotage Soviet operations, and gather intelligence. But the program attracted right-wing extremists, former fascists, and people who saw communism everywhere. In Italy, Gladio operatives were accused of carrying out false flag attacks, bombings and shootings blamed on left-wing groups to turn people against the communists. The 1980 Bologna train station bombing killed 85 people, and evidence pointed to Gladio-linked individuals trying to stir up chaos that would give a right-wing crackdown an excuse. Other attacks followed the same pattern. Bomb something public, make it look like communist terrorists did it, then use the fear to push for authoritarian policies. This strategy was called the strategy of tension. Keep citizens afraid so they'll support strong government action. When Operation Gladio was exposed in 1990, European governments were horrified. Secret armies, operating without parliamentary oversight, possibly conducting terrorist attacks against their own citizens. It was a scandal that shook several governments. The CIA and NATO claimed Gladio was necessary for Cold War defense, and that the terrorist connections were exaggerated, or the work of rogue elements. But the truth is murky. Documents were destroyed, investigations were blocked, and many people who knew the full story aren't talking. The fear of communism justified almost anything. Secret armies, hidden weapon caches, possible terrorist attacks on your own citizens, all acceptable if it meant stopping the Soviet threat. Reagan and Gorbachev's alien invasion plans. At the 1985 Geneva summit, President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev were discussing nuclear weapons and tensions between their countries. Then, Reagan said something unexpected. I bet if aliens invaded Earth, we'd work together to fight them off. Gorbachev apparently agreed. This wasn't just small talk. Reagan brought up the alien invasion scenario multiple times in speeches and meetings. In 1987, he told the United Nations General Assembly, I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. Why was Reagan obsessed with aliens? There are a few theories. Some people think he genuinely believed in UFOs. Nancy Reagan consulted astrologers, and Reagan apparently had a UFO sighting himself years earlier. Maybe he thought extraterrestrial contact was possible and wanted to prepare. Others think it was a clever negotiation tactic. By invoking a common external threat, Reagan was subtly telling Gorbachev, look, we're all humans. We shouldn't be pointing weapons at each other when there could be bigger dangers out there. It reframed the Cold War as a distraction from humanity's real challenges. There's also speculation that Reagan knew something we don't. Conspiracy theorists love pointing to his alien invasion comments as proof that the government knows about extraterrestrial life and is preparing for contact. The most likely explanation, though, is that Reagan was using a thought experiment to make a point about cooperation. By creating a hypothetical enemy that both superpowers could agree on, he was showing how artificial their conflict was. Gorbachev took the point seriously. He later wrote that Reagan's comments about aliens helped him see the American president as someone willing to think creatively about peace. Some historians credit those conversations with helping thaw Cold War tensions. So, in a weird way, talking about fictional alien invasions might have contributed to ending the real conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. Two leaders imagined fighting little green men together and realized they didn't need to fight each other. Even though the Cold War officially ended, its echoes are still with us. In geopolitics, in intelligence agencies, and in the way nations think about power and security. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe.